Hello and welcome to Taking Liberties episode 9. I am back from the United States after visiting the International Students for Liberty Conference and CPAC. So joining me today we have Zeev over in Victoria.
Howdy, Vickers. How was y'all's trip?
Pretty good. And Lee over in West Australia.
G'day.
So we'll actually get into the details of my trip a little bit later, but touching on something that I did do when I was over there was CPAC, and the big thing that went on at CPAC was obviously, um, the presidential candidates having their spiels, where Trump cancelled, which was really, really frustrating. But you've written an article about that, I understand, Zeev, The Cult of Trump, and it features on Cadillac blogs, I believe.
Yes, I have. Well, I think the explanation for Trump's power and appeal is pretty simple. Other people have held his policy positions before, and they basically amount to hating on foreigners and hating on free trade. Um, but that's not uncommon. To varying degrees, everyone's done that. I think what marks out Trump as special is his media experience. Specifically, this is a guy who ran TV shows, um, appeared in TV shows, and in that way learned what the public want. He learned how to become an effective demagogue, able to sell himself to the public. And I guess uh,
But,
he wants to
sorry,
sell above all his competence and expertise.
so
Yeah.
just to interrupt you for a second,
Mm.
it's not as if the United States is a stranger to this concept. I mean, Ronald Reagan was an actor turned politician, so
Mm.
someone who had a lot of media experience and managed to break into the GOP primaries very much as an outsider, and
Mm.
then once he became president, was a fairly competent and good president,
Mm.
despite the fact that he was labeled as a demagogue, despite the fact that he was labeled as someone who didn't quite understand economics. I mean, it's famous because it's constantly quoted, that
Mm.
famous George Herbert Walker saying about Reagan's economic policies, calling it voodoo economics.
Mm.
So it's not as if Americans are a stranger to this. It's happened to them before, and it was one of the presidencies they look back fondly on.
I mean, I think the major difference is that Trump embodies politics as feelings or feelings as politics. That is,
Mm.
what Trump is not selling any set of particular ideas. He's selling a feeling, which is true of all politicians. I mean, all of them are selling like a notional kind of
Mm.
sort of feeling. This is what
Well,
you should feel like if you support us.
well,
But it's just Trump is that concept writ large. So he is,
Trump is
he doesn't have any
actually,
solid policy.
selling
And
himself. Trump
no. So sorry,
and
sorry to interrupt. Sorry, Steve. I don't think anybody heard any of that because I kept interrupting you. Just say it again.
Trump is selling himself. Trump is selling Trump as Superman who will appoint the right people and fix the problems because he has appointed the very best out there to fix the problems, or that he is the very best out there to fix the problems that America faces.
Yeah,
Uh,
I'd have
that's,
to. Sorry, finish your thought.
uh, I guess, I mean, apart from, hammering away at free trade and immigrants, that's the key selling point for Trump. He is the expert that can control America and bring it right and make it great again. Anyway.
Yeah, so I actually have to vehemently disagree with the fact that Trump doesn't have any policies. He actually has policies. They're just policies most of us would not like very much,
no,
particularly as libertarians.
well,
Uh,
yeah, okay.
uh,
You
uh,
finish your point, and I'll come back on that one.
yeah, the biggest one is obviously the wall, right? They can obviously put up this wall. I mean, it's not as if countries haven't put up walls before. You've got Hadrian's Wall, which the Romans put up, to keep the Scots out, and you had the famous, the Great Wall of China, which was to keep Emperor Nazi Goring out, and the Romans.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
But there's that, and there's also a lot of his policies regarding immigration, a lot of his policies regarding free trade quite frankly, they were part of the Democratic platform for a long time. They were the mainstay of the Democratic Party. We're going to keep those Mexican workers who are, cutting the cost of labor. We're going to keep out those, unfairly produced products from China, which are too cheap, pricing out American labor by putting a tariff on them, evening the playing field. I've heard this rhetoric come from the Nationals in Australia. You've heard Barnaby Joyce say them. I mean, come on, like most of
Oh,
this stuff is
yeah,
common.
but I mean, the main thing, like, okay, so there's true that Trump has policies, but that's not what he's selling. And the reason you can tell that is because he has flip-flopped all over the place on almost every single issue and contradicted himself and contradicted his positions from 5 years ago and 10 years ago. Like, the guy is all over the shop policy-wise. But his people have also sold those ideas before in some form or another. The main thing is that what Trump does differently is he says, America never wins. I'm going to make America win again. So vote for me if you want America to win again. And I think it's actually it's more about the feeling, tapping into a set of feeling, tapping into a set of powerlessness. And, so if I go for the strong guy, he's going to make me feel powerful again. Yeah.
Exactly.
So it's that's the appeal of Trump. Like, he could say almost anything because he's
strong-
wrapping it up in this package of you're weak, I'm powerful, therefore support me because I'll make you powerful as well.
Exactly. That's exactly the idea. Lee's got it in a nutshell. And I guess, the libertarian critique is that, well, government officials aren't these perfect people who can just solve problems by appointing the right people or, conducting sending in the experts or saying, oh, I'm the smartest person in the room, I can do it.
I mean, and
how it works.
yeah, I mean, like, I think the part of the problem with people opposing Trump is they attack his ideas and they attack his policies, and they fail to. I think that sort of fails to understand his appeal, which is in this sense of being, and I think we sort of saw it with Obama.
Yeah.
Hope and change and all that sort of stuff. Like, but this is even more than that. I mean, this takes that same thing and makes the entirety of his appeal is based on that. So, like, I think, like, really, the only way to oppose Trump is to get at that feeling, understand why it's there, and actually you can't even necessarily undermine it, but you have to provide a different set of something that has a feeling that draws people in who are feeling alienated, and I think that's why, like, you get National Review who rage against Trump, conservatives who are raging against Trump, and I think they just totally missed the boat because that's not. His appeal is not in his policies; it's in that feeling, and they don't know how to tap into that feeling in the same way.
So it's actually interesting because when I was at CPAC, despite the fact that a lot of people didn't support, like, CPAC was Cruz Central, right? For anyone who's not familiar, CPAC is the Conservative Political Action Conference. It occurs every year. It's the big event that, basically everybody at the GOP turns out for, every presidential candidate turns out for, and usually the Ron Pauls win their straw poll, but they weren't contending this year. All of that aside, the feeling at CPAC this year, despite the fact that a lot of them were Cruz voters, is that America is in decline. And it's an interesting, being an outsider coming into the United States, it was an interesting sort of thing to look at. And you can sort of understand from their perspective why they think America's in decline. Like, from our perspective, it's just we've caught up to America, right? Everybody else was just so far behind through the 90s. And then, America just didn't progress as fast, so everybody started catching up. But the feeling in America is like we're in decline, despite the fact that in reality it's probably the case that everybody's catching up.
I mean, I think that's just a perennial sense, though. I mean, society's always on the decline. Like, you go back 500 years ago and ask people if society's on decline, and they'll say, "Oh, yes, society's falling apart." And if you go back, you can find that not paranoia, but that fear and that sense of societal decay is as old as there's literally writings that exist. So, I think
remember, like, from the American perspective, just in the 1990s, America made up like a third of the world's GDP. That's not a joke. They made up
Sure,
one in every
yeah.
$3. One in every $3 that was being exchanged anywhere in the world was American. Sorry, coming out of America. And now you're looking at a situation where, China is matching them in terms of GDP. You've got Russia that is matching them in terms of air superiority, militarily.
Well,
You
not really, because they still have 7 aircraft carriers that can go anywhere in the world, and Russia basically have to. They don't have any, and they can only reach stuff that's close enough to the range of their borders.
Yeah,
so.
yeah, but the fight is near Russia's borders, right?
Yeah, sure, yeah, that's it.
So America still has the projecting capability, but like the point is they don't have air superiority in the way they did back in the 90s. In the 90s, America just owned the skies, right? There was nothing in the skies that could tackle America. And it's coming around now where the technological capabilities of the world has caught up. And it's not the case that America isn't, like, from us as an outsider perspective, we sit there and go, like, it's not the case that America is in decline. It's just everybody's catching up. But from the American perspective, they went from dominating everything, right? Technology, military, economy, right? Just dominating everything, to now having to compete for things. And from their perspective, you can understand why Middle America might be like, well, we're in decline. Clearly, we're in decline. And yes, I mean, our perspective and our opinion might be, hey, it's just the case that everybody's catching up. You kind of expect it to, like, be miles ahead of everyone forever. But they don't want to hear that.
I mean,
yeah.
I don't think that is. I don't think the world has really, especially in military power. I don't think the world's anywhere remotely close, because the US still spends like 40% of the world's.
But what are they getting?
Military spending. Well, they're getting a whole lot. Well, I mean, they still could probably pretty much beat anybody in a fight. It could be an expensive fight, and that's about as much as it's gotten. Like, if they wanted to fight Russia, they could. It just get expensive. If they wanted to fight China, they could. It just get expensive. And America used to fighting cheap wars. So, that's probably the thing that has changed is, the expectation of grinding it out on the Western front is probably not going to happen really anymore. But I think that's less important than people feeling that way. Because in the end, all politics is about what people feel. It's not not necessarily got anything to do with reality. Like, I mean, you need to look at every single statement about trade and people's attitudes towards trade, and you can't get a bigger gap between the overwhelming consensus. Like, even the Paul Krugmans of the world have to admit that free trade is a good thing, broadly speaking. And then if you then poll the attitudes of regular people about trade, it's like it's pretty negative. So in all politics, reality doesn't matter as much as the felt reality, and America feels like they're losing. And if you ask the left why that's the case, it's because you've got all these evil, nasty Republicans, and if you ask the right why it's the case, it's because you got this evil, nasty Obama, this Muslim Obama, and blah blah blah. And that's just what Trump taps into. Like, we've America has real issues. None of the presidential candidates, except Rand Paul, maybe, have any real sense of the actual source of a lot of these problems, which is the government spending too much money, the government's too powerful, it's doing too many terrible things, and they've just got a bunch of cheap solutions that don't get anywhere remotely close to dealing with those issues.
I guess the problem is that they've failed to outline a positive vision. I mean, Rand outlined a vision of government as the problem, rather than a vision of individuals and society as the solution. I'm not saying that's that he's wrong in anything that he said necessarily. I'm just saying maybe part of the issue is that we haven't outlined a positive vision, or maybe part of the issue is that no, I think that's mostly the issue. I mean, Trump can say "Make America Great Again" or what have you. I mean, in a sense, maybe Rand should have been saying something along those lines, but with a bit more facts and logic to back it up.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that it's hard to tell, but I actually think to an extent, people love authoritarianism. It goes in cycles, so people really get on board for it. They have it. They find out it's really, really horrible. It's not much fun at all. They get out of it. Then there's a period of people going back to freedom, and then over time, it's slowly people forget why they loved freedom in the first place, and then they slowly go back to authoritarianism, and then they embrace it, and they find it's really horrible, and and the cycle continues. So, we've had a pretty good run, like essentially, more or less.
80 years, give or take?
Well, yeah, probably less, because if you look at sort of the 50s and 60s had a lot of communism going on, so it really wasn't until sort of the 80s and 90s when people like that the notion of liberal democracy really triumphed in the world. So it's been a while, and even then, even the communist regimes we've got right now, they're bad, but they're probably nowhere near as bad as they were back in the 40s and 50s. So we're probably getting to the point where people are starting to forget that authoritarianism is really bad, and guys Trump are tapping into that, and not that I actually think he's substantively any worse than any of the other candidates. Like, I think pretty much all of them are all authoritarian goons.
I think what might come out is his willingness to say things like that Muslim immigration should be banned, or
it should be in violation of their First Amendment rights, but whatever. Sorry, I said such a policy would be like in violation of First Amendment rights of existing Muslims in the country.
Sure. Leaving that aside, that's maybe because, but I mean, Japanese Americans were detained en masse, more than 100,000 people. Despite
that's a good point.
There was a Fifth Amendment in the United States protecting people from arbitrary detainment.
Yeah,
that's Sixth Amendment.
Sixth, is it? Okay.
It's the Sixth.
I defer to you. Look, the point is, these constitutions don't matter much when people amass a lot of political power and capital, and Trump may well do that. And much as we like to say he's no different, that strikes me as a major difference. That he's willing to discriminate against hundreds of thousands of people by reference to their religion, and he could go further than he has gone already.
Speaking of discrimination, I want to bring us back to Australia now, and I want to talk about the Greens and how they voted against their own same-sex marriage bill based on a deal that they had with the Liberals to pass Senate voting reform, or rather use the Senate voting reform as a double dissolution trigger in exchange to vote for, what was it, the ABCC?
Yeah.
The Australian Building
and
something.
Construction Commission?
That's the one, yeah. So they've got a vote deal going on, and yes, it forced them to vote against their own same-sex marriage bill, which was pushed forward by David Leyonhjelm. So just everybody's been putting up that tweet that the Greens were talking about in Mardi Gras. They've consistently voted for same-sex marriage at all times. Now they can't really claim that, can they?
You
guys, Dave.
I think we can all acknowledge that the Greens are a political party, that they have prioritised political gain in the long term over whatever short-term political pain this will get them. And in this case, they want to be the only real major alternative to the other minor parties in the electorate, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to get there. So, should we be surprised? Not at all.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess I wonder how much actually will hurt them, because, again, going back to what we talked about Trump, political parties sell a feeling, and the Greens very much are a part of that. Like, if essentially, we are the progressive party, vote for us, and we'll stand up for, the laundry list of progressive values. And,
Yes.
Yeah, so I don't think...
So that used to be the Democrats. Be the Democrats, right? Yeah. And the Democrats then did a deal with the Liberals over the GST, right? And it progressively killed them because every election, people kept bringing up, "Hey, you did a deal with the Liberals on this."
Well,
on this GST.
yeah, except they're not a progressive. They weren't a progressive party. They saw themselves as centrists, where Greens are explicitly a progressive party.
Yeah, but they're made up
Um,
mostly of reactionaries, right? Reactionaries who feel a certain way about certain policies, and they've been disenchanted by the fact that the labor machine doesn't, isn't broadly in line with their reactionary views.
yeah,
I actually think the Sex Party might start siphoning votes away from them, particularly in Victoria.
potentially.
Yeah.
You know, maybe it will hurt them. I'm not. I don't want to rule it out. I guess I wonder. Tribal loyalty is a very funny thing, and people are willing, when they have a tribal loyalty, they'll put up with a lot of stuff before they bail. You know, and I think the major parties speak to that more than anything. Like they're basically two shades of the same, centrist, big government, bureaucracy, bureaucracy kind of machine. Like they just churn out very similar policies, just in slightly different shades, and they still draw a lot of votes. Like there's still huge barriers to. Heck, even in the Senate, which is relatively easy for minor parties to get involved, let alone the lower house where it's almost impossible for them. So, we've had decades of the same crap coming out of the Liberal Party and the Labor Party, and it hasn't really dented their ability to fill up the Parliament. So,
No.
yeah, maybe in 10 years' time, this might affect the Greens. I think in the short term,
No.
it may not actually backfire on them.
I actually disagree based on the fact that Australia's history with third parties, right? And I'm talking DLP, I'm talking Democrats, I'm talking One Nation. The history has been, it doesn't matter where they sit on the political spectrum, as soon as they do a deal that is somewhat politically not popular with the people, people tend to flood to either major party as a result.
One Nation didn't do any deals with Howard. I mean, Howard essentially co-opted some of their rhetoric, maybe. I mean, if you believe the left.
Can I
But,
agree?
they just fell apart because they...
That the minor party vote is around 25% or 20%.
Correct. Yeah, but it's not to one minor party.
Tribalism is that strong. It may not be that strong. Anyway, go on.
No, it's just to say,
No,
minor parties just over time. I don't recall any big deal that the DLP did, and they just political parties just fade into irrelevance from time, like minor parties, and heck, even major. I mean, if you go before the founding of the Liberal Party, you can find a free. Yeah, well, you can also find the Free Trade Party. I mean, they actually didn't they even have a prime minister going back in the early days?
But because back then it was all like there were so many parties that they had to form coalitions.
Sure.
The Free Trade Party got there because they had some of the biggest seats in the country at the time. What was his name? George Reed. The Free Trade Party was never actually a big party. It just held a bunch of key seats.
Sure. But that's just to say that parties do smaller parties do come and go to an extent.
And
maybe it might be
minor parties and vice versa. It has happened.
I mean, it might lead to Richard Di Natale losing leadership. I think that's probably a more likely outcome.
Yeah.
That's.
Sorry, what's a more likely outcome?
That Richard Di Natale gets kicked as leader. I think that's probably a more likely outcome than the Greens. Over the long term, yes, maybe it might affect their vote, but certainly, I don't think they're going to be finding themselves with one or two senators at the next election and no one else. Like, it's going to be, it'd be a while, and
So if it's a double dissolution,
I think gay marriage will pass regardless of the single vote, and they will still champion gay marriage. They'll cast it as a procedural vote that'll happen really soon anyway, and that they're all for it. And I think they may suffer a bit of pain initially, but it's not going to be something that really takes them down, to be honest.
Yeah.
I actually think they might end up losing one Senate spot in Victoria in the next election to the Sex Party.
It's possible.
Yeah. And that might
frankly.
Yeah, I'm saying in the double dissolution they might lose one potential Senate spot to the Sex Party, and over time I actually suspect in Victoria and particularly Tasmania, they're gonna be fighting quite strong against Fiona Patten and basically her party. Yeah,
it's very, very possible that they will be fighting against Fiona. very hard. And gosh, I wish I could be kicking Fiona via the LDP, so to speak, and all of
Well,
that.
you guys need to sort out your preference deals with them. I think like an LDP and Sex
Mm.
Party tag team per se on the Greens vote, like
Mm.
because
Uh,
there's a lot of wealthy gay people that aren't particularly happy with some of the tax policies of the Greens and particularly the Sex Party. I reckon there's a bit of potential movement there between. Sorry, this is all like my speculation based on the numbers that I've seen, but like I think there's potential movement, and I always refer in Victoria and Tasmania because Victoria and Tasmania, in my opinion, are the places where these changes this change is going to be the biggest impact because they just seem to have less political stratification in Victoria and Tasmania than they do in New South Wales and particularly Queensland. Queensland is stratified like crazy. It budges very, very little in the Senate. Um, and same with like South Australia. South Australia and Queensland don't budge very much at all. But Victoria and Tasmania budge quite a bit and quite fast. And I think that's got to do with
It's the downfall of the Greens because Fiona's people will take charge, and that's it.
pretty much. No, my hope is they take those southern
That's my
states.
hope, but I don't
And-
know if it's inevitable
Yeah.
because I don't know at all that it's inevitable. Particularly because the Greens can put out a lot of counter messages. They could say, "Well, we don't have the numbers to pass it. It's just a symbolic move. It's just a tactic."
Yeah, I mean, tribal loyalty doesn't care too much for consistency.
Yeah.
So it depends
No,
to what
I'm
extent
hoping for
is.
the reactionary vote. I don't care about the establishment Greens. They're
Yeah.
nothing to me. They're never gonna change their vote. It's the reactionaries that they've managed to pull from Labor left that I want to take away from them, and that's currently their voting base. And I think it's very possible to reach them because they don't owe. They already abandoned Labor. due
Yeah,
to
true.
the fact-
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, that's a fair point.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess though, what impact does that have on the Sex Party? Because if you get a bunch of, I mean, you look at like someone like Adam Bandt, who said that the Greens were too bourgeois for his taste back in whenever it was, because basically he's a more hardcore socialist, and all the socialists kind of ended up flocking to the Greens. Once
But
they
they didn't change the Greens very much, did they?
well, I don't know. Like, I think it probably does have an impact. Like, it certainly puts pressure on. I mean, like, I don't think the Greens were like particularly not averse to like hating capitalism in the first place.
yeah,
But
so
like, if you think about
firstly-
someone like the Sex Party, which is fundamentally not like, I guess they don't have a particular view on something like capitalism.
Well,
you
no,
know,
the sex
like-
the sex party is, in my mind, good because they want to deregulate at least one industry,
Yeah.
which is the sex industry.
Sure.
Which is fantastic, right?
Yeah.
But they're not actually capitalists, right? If you take a look at their policy, they do support increased taxation on things like churches. Now,
Yeah.
I sit there and I'm just
So
like,
also-
well, that's not really going to work or anything, There's
Let's see.
But they're not. Oh, sorry. Go
She
Zev.
did have some concerns about payroll tax. She also doesn't seem opposed to legalizing Uber either. She's not. She's not a hardcore free marketeer. I
No.
would put her in the.
she's a very pragmatic free
Yeah.
market.
I would not say she is not a socialist.
No.
She is a centrist, economically speaking, and that's better than nothing.
But if you get a flood of radicals like socialists flooding into the Sex Party, that might push them to be more and particularly like when you look at kind of how small parties operate in different states, it gets very interesting. So you can have like in one state it's of that party has a particular flavor because a particular group of supporters dominate all the branches, and then in a different state you get a very different flavor of the party because
like- Like
So
how the Greens in New South Wales are anti-vaxxers, well as the Greens in Victoria are like, what the hell are you talking about? We shouldn't be, vaccinate your kids, guys.
exactly.
Be sensible. Yeah.
So, and if you sort of compare sort of different state, like MPs versus in the same party or notionally in the same party across state boundaries. So it's one of those things like you could get the rise of the Sex Party in New South Wales because they get a huge influx of, all these disaffected Greens Marxists. And then all of a sudden the Sex Party is not only just about deregulating the sex industry, but they're also about, fighting the man and all the rest of it. So it
Smashing
can
the
be...
patriarchy.
Yeah, he's actually the patriarchy. So it's one of those things
Well,
like
that's
you might
possible.
like it could be.
Although,
It may not be a good thing.
just aren't big fans of regulating the sex industry necessarily. There's some that are, there's some that aren't. And there's a lot of Greens who are very anti-sex worker, as Fiona likes to say often, and to differentiate herself from them. So I wouldn't go that far. I'd also point out that at least of the sex party people that I've met, they're all they're all fairly solid. There are some who are libertarian. There is that strand of thinking in the sex party as well. Obviously, it's not a majority, but it's there. So let's be optimistic and hope that it's a change for the better.
Yeah. Well, and with that, I'm going to have to call it a night for this week's episode. I suppose we'll be back again next week, and hopefully back with a full panel size. Yeah. And let's see what happens, I guess. All right. Bye.
See you, everyone.
Good night.